How do we work and lead people who are not like us? And to me, that's about being really effective with people who are different from you by recognizing, by seeing, and deeply attending to those differences to such a point where you do adapt your practices, just like we talked about in the Zoom meeting. Okay, we typically we wouldn't do these things, but we've got a global team now. And we're in 5 continents and 10 different languages. There's no way we can keep doing things the same way. Because if we do, we're going to get nothing different, right? We're not going to get the innovation that we want.
You're listening to the ISF podcast for your organization's better cybersecurity. Your host, ISF CEO Steve Durbin, is an expert in leadership, business culture transformation, and cyber strategies for today's top enterprises. I'm producer Tavia Gilbert. Today is the second in a 2-part conversation centered on cultural fluency with global leadership strategist and corporate coach Jane Hyun. Jane is the author of Breaking the Bamboo Ceiling, Career Strategies for Asians, and co-author of Flex, the new playbook for managing across differences. In this episode, Steve and Jane define cultural fluency and give more tips on fostering cohesion and innovation in global teams.
Now, you talk a lot about cultural fluency, and probably for the benefit of our listeners here, let's start with just defining what that is. We've talked a little bit about it. We've touched on it a little bit already, but let's go with a definition of it so everybody knows what we're talking about, and then we can dig into it in a bit more detail.
Sure. The simple definition of how I think about cultural fluency, particularly in leadership, is working very effectively with people who are different from you. Working very effectively with people who are different from you. So it's not just tolerating them or having them, but it's being really effective and attuned to the differences and leaning into those differences so that you can figure out how to engage and motivate them effectively. The technical definition, and I, as an interculturalist, I learned from the work of intercultural competence, which is, it's a model that actually looks at how do we respond to difference. Mm-hmm. And Milton Bennett and Mitch Hammer developed an instrument around it to diagnose that called the Intercultural Development Inventory. And the technical definition of that is the ability to shift your mindset, right? So having multiple ways to think about the same issue and adapt behaviors, right? So when in situations where there are multicultural contexts and then there's issues that are complex that need to be adapted, that you're able to adapt and change your behaviors in appropriate ways when working with different cultural communities. And so because I'm a leadership coach, I've applied that model to how do we work and lead people who are not like us. And to me, that's about being really effective with people who are different from you by recognizing, by seeing, and deeply attending to those differences to such a point where you do adapt your practices, just like we talked about in the Zoom meeting. Okay, we typically we wouldn't do these things, but we've got a global team now, and we're in 5 continents and 10 different languages. There's no way we can keep doing things the same way. Because if we do, we're going to get nothing different, right? We're not going to get the innovation that we want.
Yeah, and it's not just innovation, is it, that doesn't come about? I mean, I've seen a number of mergers and acquisitions that have failed post-deal because there's been this misunderstanding around some of the cultural norms. I mean, 2 that spring to mind. One very, very clear for me is an American organization that acquired a Swedish company. Very different cultural environments, and wanted to simply implement exactly the same working practices all the way from New York to Stockholm. And within 12 months, they had sold the company because it simply wasn't working. There was just no traction. And in fact, it was working the other way around. The Swedes were positively acting against it. It was a resistance movement that was that had started.
Right. That's right. Oh, I can imagine that the conflicts or potential disparate ways that they must have experienced as a result of that merger or acquisition. When you think about U.S., right? If this was an American acquisition, very high achievement culture, right? If you're familiar with Hofstede's cultural dimensions, he's a Dutch social psychologist who studied culture, and I'm a strong disciple of an apprentice of his research and work. And U.S. is definitely high in the achievement, high individualism for sure. So showing of strength, right, and competitiveness, right, is very much a value. Where Swedish companies, I would imagine, tend to lean a little more nurturing, right, more collaborative.
That's right.
And so the corporate cultures and the way people interact with each other and what they prioritize are probably really different.
Absolutely. And I think, taking the time beforehand to understand some of those things, to understand what is important, is time always well spent, I would say. But I've also seen instances within the United States. I mean, I remember one, again, acquisition made from New York for a company over in Oregon, in Portland,
Mm.
where the New Yorkers took away the guy's coffee. They didn't like the provider of coffee because they had a corporate provider, and it had to be that particular coffee, and again caused uproar. And
Oh,
and so
wow.
even the little things
Yes.
that you need to pay attention to perhaps were overlooked there, and it's so very easy to do. That's the point I'm making. The little things. It isn't just, we've been talking about inclusion, trying to get everybody's views, but it's the little things very often that I've found
Mm.
that can derail, and
Absolutely.
it's so hard to come back from that.
Yeah. Steve, I just want to underscore what you said about those seemingly little, and perhaps people might think not so important things because they're so little.
Yeah,
Um, when you're trying to create a more inclusive work culture where everybody feels like they can contribute and everybody feels like, whatever I say, even though they don't accomplish all my ideas, and it's valued in some way, it is those little things.
yeah,
It is those little things that can make a difference. And I think by the same token, if a leader can be attuned to those little things, right, and show that kind of empathy that engages someone who feels perhaps kind of in the margins or their voice is not always heard, I think that can make a tremendous difference in how they connect to your company, how loyal they are to you, and how much output you will get from their productivity as well.
yeah, absolutely. And certainly in the security industry, retention is a huge issue. So, really trying to create the right sort of environment where people can thrive, where people can give of their best and have fun. And that's a piece as well, I think, that is too often lost these days. And we become
Yeah.
very serious in the workplace. And it doesn't have to be that way. I'm not suggesting that we have parties every day of the week. Some people would disagree. But, we've got to bring a bit more fun back into things, haven't we?
Yeah, I like that. I like that. We have to bring in a little bit of levity, to the seriousness, and balance the seriousness of the work with not taking ourselves as seriously, right?
Yeah,
Once in a while, which I think is helpful to all of us. And I think I know I've seen it. I've experienced burnout.
yeah.
As a business owner, as an entrepreneur, I work a lot. I probably work all the time and think
Mhm.
about it all the time. And I could tell you 5 years ago when my mom passed away, and then COVID hit, and just all of this, I really didn't stop, to really take care of what was going on inside. And I hit that wall. And it wasn't until I really started to take care of who I was, and take that time to attend to what I was feeling and all of that, that I started being more productive. And it took a little bit of leaning into having fun, doing the things that I enjoy, whether it's exercising or listening to music that I like or going to shows, to really lean into what's important to me. And I think that includes spending time with other people, enjoying yourself, having a laughing moment, about silly things,
Yeah.
enjoying my kids, when they do silly things. I think those are the moments that we live for. Yeah.
And coming back to this issue of culture, for some people in the workplace, that is not perhaps considered appropriate, right? So,
Hmm.
how do you, if you're managing a global team, not everybody, I mean, humor I've always found is quite regional, quite cultural. What I might find funny over this side of the Atlantic, some of my colleagues in the United States will sort of look at me and wonder why I'm laughing, and vice versa, indeed. So, how do you go about, I suppose, trying to be inclusive when
Hmm.
it comes to some of those, again, what may seem like fairly trivial things, but can have a massive impact on people's morale?
Yeah, how can we do that? And I want to just kind of address what you said about it can be awkward, or there could be some sense of how do I even approach this topic or think about it. And I think companies tend to be, especially here in the US, very litigious
Uh-huh.
sometimes. I think
Yep.
there's fear that if I say something and I offend someone the wrong way, then I'm going to be in trouble. So why do I even bother? Why do I
Yep.
even do that? So I think I do recognize that. But the work we do, I find, is not about compliance or sensitivity training per se. It's actually about building leadership capacity to work across difference. And it's not just for one culture group or another, it's actually for everyone, right? To
Uh-huh.
build that cultural self awareness and to create an environment where we can ask questions thoughtfully, that we give some room to each other. We're not going to be perfect because we don't know everything. I mean, I don't know everything about every culture, right? I'm still learning too. I'm just as much a teacher and a student of cultural fluency. And I've been doing this for, 25 years. And so, walking into every situation in that way, but also going out of your comfort zone to engage with people who are not like you. Usually at the end of every training, any speaking engagement that I do, any kind of one-on-one, I usually say, identify a business goal or leadership goal that you have that will make a difference for your work. And then think about how being more effective with cultural fluency can help you achieve that goal, right? And then think about, because I need to give them something practical, I say, take a risk and go out of your comfort zone to build at least one relationship with someone outside of your cultural community. And that doesn't mean you like baseball and I like football. That's not what I'm talking about. Right? A little bit deeper than that, right? Someone from an ethnic culture, cultural group, community of people that you don't often hang out with, so that you can experience being the only one in the room, right? So that you can experience being in the minority. And that can give you a tremendous sense of empathy, but also probably more curiosity about, you know what, I don't know a lot. And I can learn a little bit about how these individuals also engage and also interact. That can inform my practices going forward.
Jane, we've only been able to but scratch the surface here, but already, you've given our listeners some really good insights, some really good tips around transparency of leadership, or, being authentic, reaching out, trying to understand, looking at things from a different perspective. So thank you very much for sharing that. As I said, we have only just begun to scratch the surface. You've written a number of books on this topic. I'm sure there are a number of papers as well that people can look at online. And indeed, I'm sure reach out to you to have, further deeper conversations around this, what I consider anyway to be a fascinating topic, and one which is so core to the way in which businesses are going to be successful in the future. So thank you so much for spending some time with me today, going through some of those. And as I say, for anyone listening out there, do follow up on it, because we have only just been able to scratch the surface. So thank you very much indeed, Jane.
Oh, it was a pleasure to be with you, Steve. And I'm really excited that I could begin the conversation of scratching that surface. Thank you.
We'll be back next week with another new episode. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and we'd be pleased if you'd consider sharing the episode. To become a member, get in touch with Steve directly at steve.durbin@securityforum.org or on LinkedIn at Steve Durbin. Check out all our media and resources. All of it is there to support you at securityforum.org. Don't miss the ISF Analyst Insight podcast, sharing conversations with members about the real-world applications of ISF research. The ISF podcast is produced by Talkbox Productions and Tavia Gilbert. Thanks for listening.